I found her sprawled out on the bathroom floor when I got home from work, the light above the mirror casting harsh shadows across the tiles. Deborah wasn't the type to drink much, maybe a glass of wine during dinner once in a while, but tonight, the bitter scent of alcohol hung thick in the air. Her hair was a tangled mess, plastered to the side of her face. She was still in her clothes, though they were rumpled and stained with something I couldn't quite place. I crouched down beside her, careful not to touch her just yet. She was breathing steadily, her lips slightly parted like she was in a deep sleep. At first, I thought she'd gotten sick or fainted, but then I noticed the faint scent of cologne, not hers, and definitely not mine. My eyes lingered on the stain near the hem of her blouse. Wine. No, it wasn't the right shade, and the fabric clung in a way that suggested something heavier. Grease. Food. It wasn't what I expected from her usual nights out with friends. "Deborah," I said softly, my voice catching as my throat tightened. "Hey. What's going on?" She didn't stir, and for a second, I considered waking her, but something stopped me. The mess of it all, her unkempt hair, the smudged makeup around her eyes, the faint marks on her neck. My gut twisted in ways I couldn't explain. I backed out of the bathroom and closed the door, my mind already spinning with questions I didn't want to ask. Deborah wasn't reckless. She wasn't careless. But this wasn't her. Or at least, it wasn't the version of her I thought I knew. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a drink, the ice cubes clinking against the glass as my hands shook. My gaze flicked to her phone, sitting untouched on the counter where she'd left it. The screen lit up briefly, a notification popping up, but I couldn't bring myself to look. Not yet. For the first time in 10 years of marriage, I hesitated. I didn't know if I wanted the answers to the questions that had started to form in the back of my mind. Still, the evidence was all there, wasn't it? The stains. The smell. The fact that she was sleeping on the bathroom floor like a college kid who couldn't handle her liquor. I gripped the edge of the counter, the glass forgotten in my other hand. Maybe this was nothing. Maybe I was overthinking it. But a part of me, the part that I didn't want to listen to, was already screaming that this wasn't nothing at all. I sat in the kitchen, nursing the scotch like it was medicine. Every sip burned, but the ache in my chest was worse. My mind kept replaying the moment I found her, sprawled out like a stranger in our home. It didn't add up. Deborah wasn't messy. She wasn't reckless. So why did tonight feel so off? The phone on the counter taunted me. I'd never invaded her privacy before, not in a decade of marriage. I'd always trusted her, even when work trips kept me away for weeks at a time. But trust, I realized, wasn't the same as certainty. I glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Deborah was still in the bathroom, and I didn't know how long she'd be out. I shouldn't, I thought. This was a line you didn't cross, not unless you were ready to face what might be on the other side. But then again, hadn't she already crossed one herself? I reached for her phone with shaky hands and unlocked it. The passcode hadn't changed. That should have reassured me, but it didn't. If she was hiding something, she'd be smart enough to keep it buried deeper than a lock screen. I scrolled through her messages first. The usual suspects were there: her sister, her mom, her group chat with the ladies from book club. Nothing strange. Nothing out of the ordinary. Until I saw the name. Eric. Eric wasn't just a friend. He was our friend. We'd met him 3 years ago at a mutual friend's barbecue. He was charming, the kind of guy who always knew the right thing to say. Deborah had always gotten along with him, but so had I. There was nothing unusual about the two of them texting, until I opened the conversation. It wasn't the content that set me off at first. The messages seemed innocent enough, at least on the surface. Talk about weekend plans, casual jokes, even a few pictures of a new restaurant he'd recommended. But there was something about the tone, something about the sheer volume of messages that made my skin crawl. I scrolled further. The banter turned more personal. Eric asked her if she had made it home. She did not respond to this message. My hand clenched around the phone so hard that the edges bit into my palm. The words blurred on the screen, but they'd already burned themselves into my brain. The messages stopped there. No follow-up, no clarification, but that didn't matter. I knew what I needed to know. I set the phone down carefully, as if it might explode in my hands. My breathing was shallow, my heart pounding in my chest like it was trying to escape. I stared at the screen, half hoping the messages would disappear, that I'd wake up and realize this was all some cruel nightmare. But this was real. And the truth of it was like a slow, creeping poison. I walked back to the bathroom. Deborah hadn't moved, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. For a moment, I just stood there, staring down at her, trying to reconcile the woman I loved with the one who'd sent those messages. Eric, I muttered under my breath, the name dripping with bitterness. My hands balled into fists at my sides. I had two choices. I could wake her up and confront her right then and there, or I could wait, gather more evidence, and make sure I had the full picture. A flicker of anger rose in me, sharper and hotter than anything I'd felt in years. No, not yet. Not until I knew everything. I turned and walked out of the bathroom, leaving her there on the floor. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow, I'd start getting answers. The next morning, Deborah acted as though nothing had happened. She woke up groggy but showered, changed, and even greeted me with a casual morning as she poured herself coffee. I watched her closely from the other side of the kitchen island, my hands wrapped around a mug I hadn't touched. She didn't mention the bathroom floor, the alcohol, or the disheveled mess she'd been. I half expected her to apologize, maybe laugh it off, but she didn't. Instead, she moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, humming softly to herself. Like she wasn't hiding anything. Like she hadn't been texting another man about some mysterious last night. Rough night? I asked, keeping my tone light. She glanced at me, her expression unbothered. Yeah, sorry about that. I went out with Kelsey and the girls, and I guess I overdid it a little. Wine on an empty stomach. Wine. I thought of the stains on her clothes. That wasn't wine. And she hadn't mentioned Kelsey or the girls once in the messages with Eric. Where'd you guys go? I pressed, feigning casual curiosity. That new wine bar downtown, she said easily, sipping her coffee. Her answer came too quickly, too neatly. I nodded, forcing a smile. Sounds fun. She didn't seem to notice the tension in my voice. But I noticed the way she avoided eye contact, the way she busied herself with wiping down the counter when there wasn't even anything there. After she left for her yoga class, I sat down with her phone again. The conversation with Eric hadn't changed, but I scrolled further back, digging into weeks of messages. That's when I found the pictures. They weren't explicit. Deborah wasn't reckless like that, but they were intimate. A selfie of the two of them sitting close at a restaurant. Another of her holding up a glass of champagne, Eric grinning beside her. The timestamps told me everything I needed to know. These weren't from her supposed girls' night. These were from other nights, nights she hadn't mentioned. Then I checked the calendar app on her phone. Deborah was meticulous about scheduling. If something wasn't on the calendar, it didn't exist. Except now, there were placeholders. Vague entries like meeting or dinner with no further details. One of them lined up with the selfie at the restaurant. I slammed the phone down on the counter, my pulse racing. This wasn't just a one-time mistake. It wasn't a drunken slip-up. This was deliberate. Thought out. Deborah had crossed a line, and now I had to decide how far I was willing to go to get the truth. I spent the rest of the day pretending things were normal. Deborah came home, showered, and settled into the living room with her book like she always did. She asked about my day, laughed at my stupid joke about my boss, and kissed me goodnight before we went to bed. But I couldn't sleep. Not with her lying beside me, her breathing slow and steady, like she hadn't torn a hole in our marriage. The next morning, I took my first real step. I installed a tracking app on her phone while she was in the shower. It wasn't hard, just a quick download, a few permissions granted, and it was done. She'd never notice. Deborah wasn't tech-savvy, and I wasn't proud of what I'd done, but I needed answers. By the afternoon, I had a notification. Her location pinged at a cafe across town, nowhere near her usual haunts. Curious, I drove over, parking a block away. I spotted her instantly. She was sitting by the window, laughing at something Eric was saying. He was leaning in close, his hand resting on the table between them. I clenched the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. This was it. The confirmation I'd been dreading. But I didn't storm in. I didn't make a scene. Instead, I pulled out my phone and took a picture. A part of me hated myself for it, but another part of me, the part that was already planning my next move, knew I'd need it. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Stephanie had been calm when I first showed her the evidence. Too calm. But I saw the fire in her eyes, the kind of quiet rage that doesn't burn out but waits for the right moment to strike. We sat in the cafe, hatching a plan. Stephanie leaned forward, her voice low but steady. "He thinks I'm at a book club meeting tonight," she said, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "I told him we're staying late to chat at the cafe afterward. He won't suspect a thing." "That's perfect," I replied, matching her tone. "He'll feel safe, comfortable, and that's when we'll walk in." Her fingers curled around her coffee cup, knuckles white. "I want him to see my face when it happens. I want him to know he's not as clever as he thinks he is." The evening came. I waited in my car a block away from Eric's house, my heart pounding as I checked the clock. Stephanie had texted me 20 minutes ago, heading out now. "He thinks I'll be gone for hours, asterisk." Sure enough, the tracker I'd planted on Deborah's phone showed her heading straight for Eric's place. I could picture it already. The stolen glances, the laughter, the lies they'd spun to keep their affair alive. Stephanie pulled up behind me, stepping out of her car in a trench coat and heels that clicked sharply against the pavement. Her expression was cold, determined. "Are you ready for this?" I asked as she approached. She glanced at Eric's house, the lights glowing warmly from the windows. "I've been ready since the day I suspected," she said. Together, we walked up the driveway. Stephanie reached into her pocket and pulled out a key. She turned to me briefly. "He gave me this years ago. Never thought I'd use it like this." The lock clicked, and we stepped inside. The house was quiet except for the muffled sound of voices coming from the living room. We crept closer, and that's when I heard it. Deborah's laughter, light and flirtatious, the kind she hadn't used with me in months. "Eric," she said, her voice low and teasing. "You're terrible." His reply was even lower, almost a growl. "And you love it." Stephanie's jaw tightened, and I felt a surge of anger so sharp I could barely think. We turned the corner, stepping into the living room, and the scene hit me like a punch. Deborah was on the couch, her blouse unbuttoned at the top, revealing the edge of lace beneath. Eric was leaning over her, his hand trailing up her thigh. The wine glasses on the coffee table, the rumpled throw blanket, it all screamed intimacy, something raw and undeniable. They froze when they saw us, Deborah's cheeks flushing as she scrambled to sit upright. Eric's face twisted into a mixture of shock and panic. "Don't stop on our account," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "Stephanie," Eric started, but she cut him off. "Don't you dare," she hissed, stepping forward. "Don't you dare try to explain this away. I saw the texts. I saw the pictures. And now this." She gestured to Deborah, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the couch cushions. Deborah turned to me, her eyes wide and desperate. "Tom, Save it," I snapped, my voice cold. "I already know. The messages. The lies. All of it. You didn't even bother to cover your tracks." Eric stood, his hands raised as if surrendering. "Look, man, this isn't." "Don't finish that sentence," I warned, stepping closer. My fists clenched at my sides, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd lose control. Stephanie, meanwhile, turned her attention back to Eric. You brought her into our home. Into our bed, didn't you? Her voice cracked, but she held her ground. Eric's silence was all the confirmation she needed. Deborah's head dropped, her hands trembling in her lap. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she muttered. Spare me the excuses, I said, glaring at her. You knew exactly what you were doing. And so did he. Stephanie pulled out her phone and snapped a picture of the two of them, frozen in their guilt. This is for the divorce lawyer, she said coldly. You'll be hearing from her soon. I nodded, stepping back toward the door. We're done, Deborah. Don't come home tonight. In fact, don't come home at all. Her head shot up, her eyes brimming with tears. Tom, please. But I was already walking away, Stephanie close behind me. As we stepped outside, the cool night air hit me like a cleansing wave. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace. Stephanie turned to me, her expression softening. What now? I exhaled, my breath visible in the cold air. Now we move on. And they deal with the mess they made. And with that, we walked to our cars, leaving behind the wreckage of their betrayal. The next morning, the house was silent. Deborah hadn't come home, and I knew she wouldn't dare. I sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee growing cold in my hands, staring at nothing in particular. The night before had been explosive, something I'd imagined 100 times in my head, but the reality of it was messier. I thought I'd feel satisfaction, maybe even a twisted sense of triumph, but instead, there was a dull ache where my anger had been. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the loss of the life I thought we had. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Stephanie. This morning I was at the lawyer's office, preparing the divorce papers. Thank you for showing me the truth. I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. I'm sorry you had to find out like that. But you deserve better. Her response came almost instantly. So do you. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, letting her words sink in. Stephanie was right. I did deserve better. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Deborah texted me later that afternoon. Can we please talk? I know I messed up. I need to explain. Explain. What was left to explain? I left the message unanswered. I didn't trust myself to respond calmly, and besides, what could she possibly say that would make this better? Instead, I focused on practical matters. I called a lawyer, setting up an initial consultation to discuss my options. I didn't know yet if I wanted to file for divorce, but I needed to be prepared. I also began gathering more evidence, bank statements, shared accounts, anything that might show how long this had been going on. If Deborah wanted to fight, I was going to make damn sure I came out ahead. 2 days later, Deborah showed up at the house. I heard her car pull into the driveway and watched as she hesitated on the porch, wringing her hands before finally ringing the doorbell. When I opened the door, she looked small and fragile, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. Tom, she said softly, her voice cracking. Please. I need to talk to you. I stepped aside, letting her in. She stood in the entryway, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. I didn't offer her a seat. What do you want, Deborah? I asked, my tone flat. Her bottom lip quivered, but she steadied herself. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean much right now, but I am. I made a terrible mistake. I crossed my arms, leaning against the wall. Which part are you sorry for? The lies, the texts, or sleeping with him in his house? She flinched like I'd slapped her. All of it. She took a deep breath. I wasn't thinking clearly. I let things get out of control, and I didn't know how to stop. Didn't know how to stop. I repeated, my voice rising. You knew exactly what you were doing, Deborah. You planned this. Over and over again. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I wasn't happy, Tom," she whispered. The words hit me like a hammer. I stared at her, my chest tightening. "And you think I was? You think I haven't had bad days, rough patches, times where I wondered if we were even working anymore? But I didn't go looking for someone else, Deborah. I stayed. I worked on it. Because that's what you do when you love someone." She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "I do love you. I swear I do. I was just lost. Lost." That word made me laugh, a bitter sound that echoed through the hallway. "You weren't lost. You were selfish. You didn't care who you hurt as long as you got what you wanted." She reached for me, but I stepped back. "Tom, please. Don't do this. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, start over. I'll do whatever it takes." I shook my head, the anger draining from me, leaving only exhaustion. "You don't get it, do you? You didn't just cheat on me, Deborah. You destroyed the foundation of our marriage. How do I come back from that? How do I trust you again?" She didn't answer, just stood there crying, her shoulders shaking. Finally, I said, "You need to leave. I'll let you know when we can talk about the next steps. But right now, I can't do this." She hesitated, then nodded, wiping her face with trembling hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered again as she walked out the door. I closed it behind her, leaning against it as a wave of relief and sadness washed over me. That night, I sat alone in the house that had once been our home, the silence pressing in on me. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the memories we'd made, and the life we'd built. And then I thought about Eric, about the betrayal, and about the lies that had shattered it all. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the same man I'd been before this. And maybe that was a good thing. It was time to rebuild. To start over. And this time, I wouldn't let anyone take advantage of me again. The weeks after Deborah's betrayal were some of the hardest of my life. I'd always thought of myself as a man who could handle anything. Stress at work, financial setbacks, even the occasional rough patch in my marriage. But this was different. This wasn't something I could grit my teeth and power through. It was a dismantling, brick by brick, of everything I thought I knew. I spent the first few days in a daze. Deborah texted me constantly, pleading for another chance. She left voicemails, long ones, her voice cracking with desperation as she begged me not to give up on us. But every time I heard her voice, the memory of her and Eric on that couch came roaring back, and my resolve hardened. I needed space. I needed to be angry. I threw myself into work, staying late at the office and volunteering for every project I could get my hands on. It wasn't healthy, and I knew it, but it was better than sitting alone in the house with nothing but my thoughts. Stephanie reached out a few times, checking in on me. She'd filed for divorce immediately after our confrontation, cutting Eric out of her life like a cancer. "He's trying to apologize," she told me during one of our calls. "Says he made a mistake, that he wants to make things right." She laughed bitterly. "He didn't think about making things right when he was sneaking around with your wife." I agreed. Eric and Deborah didn't deserve reconciliation. They deserved each other. Stephanie's updates on her divorce made me realize I couldn't keep delaying my own decisions. So, one morning, I finally sat down with the lawyer I'd called weeks ago. "Do you want to file for divorce immediately, or are you looking for a separation first?" the lawyer asked, her tone professional but kind. I hesitated for only a moment before answering. Divorce. The word felt heavy on my tongue, but also freeing. The hardest part wasn't the legal process or even Deborah's continued attempts to reach me. It was the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts. Every room in the house felt haunted by memories of her. The kitchen, where we'd cook together on lazy Sunday mornings. The living room, where we'd binge-watched our favorite shows. Even our bed felt like a battlefield. I couldn't sleep there anymore. One night, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, staring at the space we'd once shared. My eyes lingered on the neatly made bed, the picture of us on the nightstand. I walked over, picked up the photo, and studied it. It was from our honeymoon in Italy. Deborah was smiling at the camera, her hand on my chest, the sunlight making her hair shine. We looked happy. I set the picture face down on the nightstand and left the room. That weekend, I started packing up her things. It was therapeutic in a way, boxing up the remnants of our life together. Her clothes, her jewelry, the books she'd never actually read. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it all. Drop it off at her parents' house, maybe, but I knew I couldn't keep it here. This house was mine now, and I needed to make it feel that way. Stephanie and I met for coffee a few weeks later, something that had become a bit of a routine. We weren't exactly friends, but there was a shared understanding between us, a bond formed through mutual betrayal. "How are you holding up?" she asked, stirring her tea. "Better," I admitted. "The house feels quieter now that her stuff is gone." She smiled faintly. "Yeah, I know the feeling. I packed up Eric's things last week. Dropped them off at his office. Told him I never wanted to see him again." "Good for you." She looked at me for a moment, her expression softening. "You're handling this better than I thought you would." I laughed. "You didn't see me 2 weeks ago. I was a mess." "We all were," she said. "But you're doing the right thing. Moving forward." I nodded, letting her words sink in. I didn't feel like I was moving forward most days, but maybe that's what healing looked like. Small steps, barely noticeable, until one day you realized you weren't standing in the same place anymore. The divorce papers were finalized 6 months later. Deborah tried to fight it at first, begging for a chance to prove she could change, but eventually, she accepted the inevitable. We sold the house and split the proceeds, and I used my share to buy a smaller place on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. One evening, as I unpacked the last of my boxes, I found the old honeymoon photo I'd shoved into a drawer months ago. I stared at it for a long moment before slipping it into the trash. This wasn't my life anymore. I wasn't the man I'd been back then, and I wasn't the man Deborah had betrayed. I was something new, someone who'd been broken and put back together stronger. For the first time in months, I felt free. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready to turn the page and start a new chapter. And this time, I'd make damn sure it was mine. Life after the divorce was quieter, simpler, and a little lonely. I kept myself busy with work and spent evenings fixing up my new house. It wasn't much, a modest 2-bedroom with creaky floors and an overgrown backyard, but it was mine. Stephanie and I still kept in touch. What had started as shared venting sessions about Deborah and Eric had turned into something more casual. We didn't talk often, but every now and then, one of us would check in. It felt good to have someone who understood. One evening, as I sat on the back porch with a beer, my phone buzzed with a text from Stephanie. "Can I call you?" I frowned, setting my beer down and typing back. "Of course. Everything okay?" The phone rang almost immediately. "Hey," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Hey," she replied, her voice steady but hesitant. I need your opinion on something." "Shoot." She sighed. "Eric wants to meet. Says he needs closure or something." I sat up straighter, my grip tightening on the phone. "Closure? For what?" "He's the one who blew everything up." "That's what I said," she muttered. "But he's been emailing me nonstop, and I guess I don't know. A part of me wants to hear him out. See if he'll admit to everything." I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. "Stephanie, you don't owe him that. He doesn't deserve any more of your time." "I know," she said quickly. "And I don't want to give him any. But part of me," she trailed off, then sighed again. "Part of me feels like I need to say something. To make it clear that he didn't win." I was quiet for a moment, weighing her words. I understood where she was coming from. I'd felt the same pull, a need to confront Deborah one last time, to say the things I hadn't been able to say in the heat of the moment. But was it worth it? "What are you thinking of doing?" I asked. "I was thinking," she said slowly, "that maybe you could come with me. Not to talk, just to be there. For support. I blinked, caught off guard. You want me there? Yes, she said firmly. I trust you, Tom. And honestly, I think it would throw him off. He wouldn't expect it. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the darkening sky. The thought of seeing Eric again made my blood boil, but a part of me was curious. Maybe this was the closure I needed, too. When are you thinking of doing this? I asked. Tomorrow evening, she said. He's meeting me at that cafe downtown. The one we planned everything at. The irony wasn't lost on me. All right, I said finally. I'll be there. The cafe was quiet when I arrived the next evening, the soft hum of conversation blending with the hiss of the espresso machine. Stephanie was already there, sitting at a corner table with her arms crossed. She looked calm, collected, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Hey, I said, sliding into the seat beside her. Hey, she replied, managing a small smile. Thanks for coming. Of course. I glanced toward the door. Is he here yet? She shook her head. Not yet. But he will be. A few minutes later, Eric walked in. He looked much the same as he had the night of the confrontation. Confident, a little smug, like he still thought he could charm his way out of anything. His eyes widened when he saw me sitting beside Stephanie. Tom, he said, stopping in his tracks. What are you doing here? I'm here for her, I replied coolly. And to make sure you don't try anything stupid. He hesitated, then forced a smile and pulled out the chair across from us. Fair enough, he said, sitting down. For a moment, none of us spoke. Stephanie broke the silence. You said you needed closure, she said, her tone sharp. So, talk. Eric shifted uncomfortably. Look, I know I messed up. I made a mistake. A mistake. Stephanie interrupted, her voice rising. You didn't trip and fall into an affair, Eric. You lied. For months. He flinched but didn't argue. You're right. I lied. I hurt you, and I'm sorry. But I couldn't help it. Deborah and I. Stop, I said, my voice cutting through his excuse. Don't. You don't get to sit here and justify what you did. You hurt both of us. You broke 2 marriages. And for what? Some thrill. Eric's jaw tightened, his confidence faltering. It wasn't just a thrill, he muttered. Then what was it? Stephanie demanded. Love. Lust. What was it that made you throw everything away? He looked away, his hands clenching on the table. I don't know, he admitted. Stephanie laughed bitterly. Of course you don't. Because it wasn't about me or her. It was about you. Your ego. Your need to feel wanted. Eric opened his mouth to respond, but she held up a hand. Don't bother. I didn't come here to hear excuses. I came here to tell you that you don't get to take up any more space in my life. You're done. Her words hung in the air like a final nail in the coffin. I stood, placing a hand on Stephanie's shoulder. Let's go, I said. She nodded, standing beside me. Eric stayed seated, his head bowed, the weight of his choices finally settling on him. As we walked out of the cafe, Stephanie let out a long breath. That felt good, she said. You were amazing, I replied. She glanced at me, a small smile tugging at her lips. Thanks for being there, Tom. Always. And as we stepped into the cool night air, I felt lighter, like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. It wasn't closure in the traditional sense, but it was enough. The night at the cafe lingered in my mind for days. Seeing Eric squirm, watching Stephanie reclaim her power, it gave me a sense of satisfaction I hadn't thought I needed. It felt like a line had been drawn in the sand, a boundary that no one would cross again. Stephanie and I didn't talk much about the confrontation afterward. We didn't need to. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, a shared sense that we could finally move on. The weeks turned into months, and life slowly began to feel normal again. Or, at least, a new kind of normal. My evenings were no longer spent dwelling on the past but building a future. I took up running, something I hadn't done since my 20s. At first, it was just an excuse to get out of the house, to burn off the restless energy that seemed to follow me everywhere. But over time, it became a ritual. There was something about the rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement, the cool morning air filling my lungs, that cleared my mind. I also started fixing up the house in earnest. The creaky floors, the peeling paint, the overgrown yard. I tackled it all, one project at a time. Each improvement felt like a small victory, a step toward making the space truly mine. One afternoon, as I was pulling weeds in the backyard, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Stephanie. "Hey, what are you doing this weekend?" I wiped the sweat from my brow and typed back. "Nothing planned." "Why?" Her response came quickly. "I was thinking of heading to the farmer's market on Saturday. Want to join me?" Asterisk. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers hovering over the screen. This felt different, more personal. But then again, hadn't everything about our connection been personal from the start? Sure. What time? Saturday morning was crisp and sunny, the kind of early autumn day that made you want to spend hours outside. The market was bustling, rows of colorful produce and artisan goods lining the streets. Stephanie was waiting for me near the entrance, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail and a light scarf draped around her neck. She looked different, lighter somehow. "Hey," she said, smiling as I approached. "Hey," I replied. This was a good idea. It's been a while since I've done something like this. "Me too," she admitted. Figured it was time to get out of my head for a bit. We wandered through the stalls, chatting easily about everything and nothing. She told me about her plans to sell the house she'd shared with Eric, how she was thinking of moving closer to her sister. I told her about my latest house project, a disastrous attempt at building a deck that had ended with me calling a contractor. "You're lucky you didn't break something," she teased, nudging me with her elbow. "What can I say? I like to live dangerously," I replied, grinning. It felt good to laugh like this, to talk without the weight of the past hanging over us. As we reached the end of the market, Stephanie paused in front of a flower stall. She picked up a small bouquet of sunflowers, holding them up to her nose. "These were my mom's favorite," she said softly, her smile turning wistful. "They suit you," I said without thinking. She looked up at me, surprised. For a moment, we just stood there, the noise of the market fading into the background. "Thanks," she said finally, her voice quiet. I cleared my throat, feeling a sudden awkwardness settle between us. "Well, if you're buying those, I guess I'll grab something too." I picked out a small potted plant, something I could actually keep alive, and paid for it while she watched, still holding her sunflowers. As we walked back to our cars, she turned to me. "I had a good time today," she said. "Me too," I replied. "We should do this again sometime." Her smile widened, and for the first time, I realized how beautiful it was when it wasn't weighed down by sadness. "Yeah," she said. "We should." That night, as I sat on the porch with the potted plant beside me, I thought about the day. About Stephanie. About the way she'd smiled when she talked about starting over. It wasn't love, at least, not yet. But it was something. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was living it. The weeks after the farmer's market brought a subtle but undeniable shift in my relationship with Stephanie. We started texting more frequently, sometimes about mundane things. Photos of her dog curled up on her couch, or a picture of the latest disaster I'd encountered while renovating my house. Other times, the conversations ran deeper. One evening, after I sent her a picture of my half-finished deck with the caption asterisk, "Still alive." "Barely." Asterisk, she called instead of replying by text. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" she teased as soon as I answered. "Where's the fun in quitting?" I shot back. She laughed, a sound that had become oddly comforting. "Well, if you fall through that thing, don't expect me to bring flowers to the hospital. I'll bring a 'told you so' balloon instead." "Fair enough," I said, smiling. There was a pause, And then her voice softened. Thanks for today, by the way. I didn't realize how much I needed that until I got home. Me neither, I admitted. It was nice. Normal, even. Normal is good, she said. Yeah, I replied. Normal is good. The next time we met up, it wasn't planned. I ran into her at a small coffee shop on a rainy Saturday morning, both of us ducking in for shelter with no umbrella in sight. Tom, she said, looking up from the counter where she was paying for her latte. Stephanie, I said, shaking rainwater from my jacket. What are the odds? She smiled, tucking a strand of damp hair behind her ear. I think we might be stalking each other. Either that or we both have the same terrible taste in coffee shops, I joked. She rolled her eyes but laughed. What's terrible about this place? They have great pastries. Guess I'll have to find out. We ended up sitting together by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. It was the kind of weather that made you want to stay indoors, warm and safe, with no particular plans. Somehow, we ended up talking about the past. Not Eric and Deborah specifically, but the aftermath of it all. You ever feel like you're just floating, she asked, stirring her coffee. Like you're not really sure where you're supposed to go next. All the time, I admitted. It's like everything you thought you knew gets pulled out from under you, and you're just standing there, trying to figure out what's left. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's weird, though. Sometimes I think this is the best thing that could have happened to me. Like I finally have a chance to figure out who I am without him. Yeah, I said, surprised by how much her words resonated with me. I get that. It's strange, but for the first time in years, I feel free. She looked at me, her eyes searching. Free to do what? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But the question stayed with me long after we'd parted ways. A few weeks later, Stephanie invited me over to her house. I'm selling it soon, she said. But I could use an extra set of hands to help pack up. When I arrived, the place was already half empty, boxes stacked in every corner. The memories of her life with Eric were packed away now, stripped of sentimentality. Thanks for coming, she said as she handed me a cup of coffee. I know this isn't exactly a fun Saturday activity. Hey, what are friends for? I replied. She smiled, but there was something tentative about it, like she wasn't sure if we were still just friends or something more. We worked side by side for hours, sorting through books, dishes, and knickknacks. At one point, we found an old photo of her and Eric from their honeymoon, stuffed in the back of a drawer. She stared at it for a moment, her expression unreadable, before handing it to me. Trash, she said simply. I didn't hesitate, dropping it into the bin. Feels good, doesn't it? I asked. Better than I expected, she said, her voice lighter. By the time we finished, it was late, and the takeout we'd ordered was sitting empty on the counter. Stephanie poured us each a glass of wine, and we ended up on the couch, talking about everything from childhood dreams to bad TV shows we secretly loved. At some point, the conversation slowed, and the silence between us stretched out, not awkward, but charged. She looked at me, her eyes searching. You've been good to me, Tom. More than I deserve. I shook my head. You deserve someone who sees your worth, Stephanie. You always have. Her breath hitched slightly, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But instead, she smiled, leaning closer. I don't know what I'd do without you. The air between us felt heavy, and I knew this was a crossroads. I could lean in, close the gap, or I could step back and let it pass. I didn't move right away. I just looked at her, searching her face for some kind of answer. Stephanie, I began, my voice trailing off. But she closed the gap for me, her lips brushing against mine, soft and tentative. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was slow, careful, like we were both testing the waters. When we pulled back, her cheeks were flushed, and I could feel my heart pounding. She started, but I cut her off with a soft smile. Me too, I said simply. For the first time in a long time, it felt like something was starting instead of ending. The kiss with Stephanie lingered in my mind for days, a quiet echo of something I hadn't let myself feel in months: hope. We didn't rush into anything, and for the first time, I felt no need to. There was a mutual understanding between us, an unspoken agreement to let things unfold naturally. Still, that moment on her couch had shifted something. It wasn't just the kiss itself, but the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward for both of us. We started spending more time together after that. It wasn't anything grand, just simple things. A trip to a hardware store to grab supplies for her house repairs. A lazy Sunday afternoon at the park, where her dog, Milo, ran circles around us. Dinner at my place, where I discovered Stephanie had a knack for burning toast but could make a killer spaghetti sauce. One evening, as we sat in my living room watching an old movie, she turned to me, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "Are we doing this?" she asked. "Doing what?" I replied, though I knew exactly what she meant. "This," she said, gesturing between us. "Whatever this is." I thought for a moment, trying to find the right words. "I think we are," I said finally. "But I don't want to rush it. I want to do it right." Her lips curved into a small smile. "Me too." And that was enough. Over the next few months, our relationship grew in ways I hadn't expected. There was no drama, no mind games, just two people learning to trust again after being burned. It was refreshing, even a little surreal. Stephanie sold her house and moved into an apartment closer to her sister. It was smaller, cozier, and when I helped her unpack, I noticed how much lighter her belongings were. She'd let go of so many things from her old life, and it was clear she was making space for something new. "You're brave, you know that?" I told her one night as we sat on the floor of her new living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. She laughed softly. "Brave? I'm a mess." "No," I said, meeting her eyes. "You've been through hell, and you came out stronger. That's not a mess. That's resilience." Her smile faltered, and for a moment, I saw the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said quietly. "And I couldn't have done it without you," I replied. One day, months later, I got a call from Deborah. It had been nearly a year since the divorce, and her voice on the other end of the line sent a wave of emotions crashing over me. "Tom," she said, hesitant, "can we talk?" I considered hanging up. But instead I asked, "What do you want?" She sighed. I wanted to apologize. For everything. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realized how much I hurt you. You didn't deserve that." Her words were sincere, and for the first time, I didn't feel the anger or resentment I'd carried for so long. "I appreciate that," I said. "But it's too late for apologies, Deborah. I've moved on." There was a long pause. "I'm glad," she said finally. "You deserve to be happy." "So do you," I replied, meaning it. When the call ended, I sat there for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. It felt like the final piece of closure I hadn't realized I needed. A few weeks later, Stephanie and I went to dinner at a quiet little restaurant downtown. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was the kind of place where you could talk for hours without feeling rushed. As we sat across from each other, I realized how far we'd both come. The pain of the past still lingered, but it no longer defined us. "I've been thinking about something," I said, swirling my wine glass absently. Stephanie raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I think I'm ready," I said. "To start over. To really start over. With you." Her eyes softened, and she reached across the table, her hand brushing mine. "I've been waiting for you to say that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't the life I'd planned, but maybe that was the point. Sometimes, the best things come from the pieces we're forced to rebuild. As we walked out of the restaurant that night, hand in hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The kind that comes not from forgetting the past, but from embracing it and letting it shape a stronger, wiser version of yourself. Stephanie squeezed my hand, and I looked over at her, my heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, I wasn't looking back. I was looking forward. Together.